Now, the US would have you believe that its intervention in Venezuela had everything to do with drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. But is it really so? What did Trump seek to achieve by capturing Maduro? Aman Kumar Himanshu takes a deep dive into the real story behind the headlines.
First, the elephant in the room, oil. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven reserves of oil, more than 300 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia or Iran. Nearly 20% of the world's total. That's a treasure trove. But Venezuela contributes less than 1% to worldwide oil production. Production has plummeted from 3.2 million barrels a day in 2000 to barely a million under President Maduro because of mismanagement and crippling US sanctions. President Trump didn't mince words in his 3rd January press conference at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida.
So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Just days later, President Trump announced that Venezuela would hand over 30 to 50 million barrels to the US at market price, with proceeds supposedly benefiting both nations. He's already courting Chevron, Exxon, and ConocoPhillips for billions in investments to revive Venezuela's oil industry. Chevron, which is the only major US oil company currently operating in Venezuela, stands to gain the most. US business news channel CNBC says that the market has already anointed Chevron as the big winner in Venezuela. Exxon and Conoco eye billions in unpaid compensation for past seizures after President Trump framed the US intervention in Venezuela as reclaiming what was stolen from US companies whose assets were nationalized years ago. He has floated the idea of reimbursing the US firms for infrastructure fixes.
The oil companies are going to go in, they're going to spend money, we're going to take back the oil that, frankly, we should have taken back a long time ago. A lot of money is coming out of the ground. We're going to get reimbursed for all of that. We're going to get reimbursed for everything that we spend.
In addition to its vast oil reserves, Venezuela boasts significant deposits of precious metals, including rare earths, that are vital for the US technology and defense industries. Venezuela's Guiana Shield region is rich in deposits of gold, diamond, iron ore, and bauxite. Bottom line, oil isn't just a motive, it is the prize. But, to be sure, the US has enough oil of its own for it to now start coveting Venezuela's vast reserves, a point that the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio sought to make in a recent interview to US TV network NBC.
We don't need Venezuela's oil. We have plenty of oil in the United States. What we're not going to allow is for the oil industry in Venezuela to be controlled by adversaries of the United States.
So, if it's not only about oil, what else could it be? Enter petrodollar, the invisible glue holding US economic hegemony together. Since the 1970s, when Henry Kissinger brokered the deal with Saudi Arabia, global oil has been priced in dollars, forcing nations to hold dollars for energy purchases. When trade is conducted in dollars, it flows through US banks, enabling Washington, D.C. to use sanctions and asset freezes as a tool to exert pressure on adversaries. But President Maduro challenged that. In 2018, Venezuela ditched the dollar for oil sales, accepting yuan, euros, and rubles instead. Venezuela's shift away from the dollar was initially a survival tactic against US sanctions, but it became a strategic threat because of the scale of Venezuela's resources. With its vast oil reserves, Venezuela could fund de-dollarisation for decades, eroding the US's financial edge. By capturing President Maduro and steering Venezuela back into the US orbit, President Trump ensures that future oil flows stay dollar-dominated, bolstering the petrodollar against potential challenges. As one analyst put it, challenge the dollar and the battlefield finds you. Or to put it crudely, as the US government did, FAFO. A post on the X and Instagram accounts of the White House showed President Trump in black and white alongside the letters FAFO. The internet slang means mess with us and you'll pay. So it's not just economics, it's preserving the US empire. Closely tied to that is a perceived threat from the BRICS group of nations. This bloc, comprises Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It has since expanded to include 5 more countries: Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. BRICS is developing what is known as the BRICS Bridge, a blockchain-based payment platform aimed at linking the financial systems of member states to facilitate settlements in central bank digital currencies. Alongside this, there are discussions about introducing a new settlement currency called the unit, which could be backed 40% by gold and 60% by the local currencies of BRICS nations. These alternative payment systems are intended to serve as an alternative to the dollar and the US-dominated global banking network known as SWIFT. SWIFT stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. The Belgian-based organization was established in 1973. Banks and other member firms use its service for initiating international payments. Venezuela petitioned BRICS to join in 2023, forging direct yuan-based channels with China that sidestep US oversight. If President Maduro's regime had succeeded, it would have become a BRICS beachhead in Latin America, accelerating global de-dollarisation. But President Trump's raid sends a clear message: no safe havens for those undermining US financial supremacy. BRICS nations are already decrying this as armed aggression, but the damage is done. Venezuela's integration is stalled, and the bloc's momentum might have been checked for now. What about payback? Did President Trump reward US oil majors who fueled his comeback? Campaign finance tells a tale. Big Oil poured $96 million into President Trump's 2024 bid, and super PACs, part of a staggering $450 million spent on influence operations. A PAC is a US political committee that can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money to advocate for or against political candidates. Tycoons such as Harold Hamm and Kelsey Warren hosted fundraisers responding to President Trump's explicit pitch: raise $1 billion and I'll deliver your wish list. Tax breaks, deregulation, and fast-track mergers. Hamm and Warren also happen to be influential billionaire figures in the US fossil fuel industry. Now, after President Maduro's capture, these companies get first dibs on Venezuela's fields. And finally, the geopolitical chessboard. Countering Russia and China, President Maduro's Venezuela was a key ally for both. China as a top oil buyer with $19 billion in loans tied to crude, and Russia with arms deals and stakes in oil fields. Chinese companies claim billions of barrels under existing pacts, which are now in limbo. President Trump's move disrupts their supply chain, squeezes discounted oil flows to Beijing, and undercuts Moscow's Latin American leverage all at once. The US is now pressing Venezuela's interim government to dismiss all suspected spies and other intelligence agents from China, Russia, Cuba, and Iran from the South American country. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has asked Caracas to expel advisors from these countries. It's a revival of the Monroe Doctrine, rebranded as the Donroe Doctrine. It's a wordplay on US President James Monroe, who set out a doctrine in 1823 that asserted US influence in the Western Hemisphere. The term was initially popularized by the New York Post newspaper. President Trump advocates a more aggressive and interventionist US foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. By muscling out these rivals, the US not only secures resources, but reasserts dominance in the Americas. President Trump's policy was outlined in the National Security Strategy published in November 2025. It plainly stated that it is the Trump government's stated intention to reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore US preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. So, to answer the question, why did the US capture President Maduro? It's a cocktail of motives: oil as the fuel, petrodollar and BRICS as the threats, big oil rewards as the sweetener, and anti-Russia and anti-China strategy as the end game. What about drugs flowing into the US, as President Trump alleges? Could fentanyl and drug trafficking be to Venezuela what anthrax and weapons of mass destruction were to Iraq? With the benefit of hindsight, narco-terrorism was a pretext to cover for deeper plays. The US intervention in Venezuela raises alarms. Legally dubious under international law and no US mandate. Critics call it a modern-day resource grab, echoing US interventions in Iraq or Libya. Some analysts have drawn parallels with Iraq, When the US cited threats from weapons of mass destruction to justify its invasion of Iraq and subsequent capture of Saddam Hussein, the then US President George W. Bush insisted that the war was not over oil, even though many remained unconvinced. Today, 23 years on, history is repeating itself in more ways than one. No laughing matter, this. Take a look at this video by US comedian Jon Stewart, who hosts a satirical news program called The Daily Show.
I'm not even going to play around anymore. It. Hit me with the works. Iraq, Venezuela.
President Maduro crossed a red line by selling oil outside the dollar system and paid the price for it with his capture and eventual ouster from power. Challenging the petrodollar and the US monetary architecture proved to be his cardinal sin. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would sell its oil in euros instead of the US dollar, a move that was seen as a direct challenge to the petrodollar system. Within a few years, the US invaded Iraq, and Iraqi oil sales switched back to the dollar after Saddam Hussein was toppled. Similarly, Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, proposed a gold-backed pan-African currency. It was meant to price oil outside the US dollar system. The move drew fierce opposition from the US. And lo and behold, in 2011, Gaddafi's government was overthrown in a military intervention by a NATO-led coalition, which followed a civil war. Not surprisingly, Libya's oil trade returned to the dollar soon thereafter. As the world watches Venezuela's new leader, Delcy Rodriguez, navigate this minefield, one thing is clear. In geopolitics, power flows where the oil does. Aman Kumar Himanshu for DD India.